In this video, we'll be taking a look at shading networks in Maya and how they're created and edited in the Hypershade. In this example, we have the red wagon, which has some shaders on it, has some textures as well that were created in Photoshop, as well as some procedural textures that were created in Maya. Let's take a look at one of the panels. We'll go ahead and select this one, and then the Hypershade graph selected. In the work window, we can maximize so we only see the work window. We can also move our panel over. We can see the B panel stripe is a blend and has a color map assigned to it. You'll see that the map buttons on the side of these attributes for the color is a different icon, which stands for an input connection. That input connection happens to be a Photoshop file that was created strictly for this purpose. To create a connection to a texture, you simply click one of the texture icons. Let's say we want to put a color on the incandescence. We'll go ahead and click the map icon, and that brings up the Create Render node. And in the Create Render node, you'll see all of the different textures, environment textures, 2D, 3D, and other that are available within Maya. Some of these are procedural, and some of these will give you access to a file. So if we click on the File node, we'll have access to our files. And let's bring in one of our TIFFs. Let's say this one. We'll open that. We'll see we've got a new connection. Now this shading network is fairly simple. This node is the shading group node, which is shown right here. This is the node that essentially attaches the material to the object, to the mesh. Here's our material node, or our shader. These are file nodes, and these two little guys are placement nodes that tell the file nodes where to go. You can see there's a connecting line with a little arrow that shows the direction of that connection. The file is leading into the shader. If you mouse over the connection, it'll tell you what the connection is. With a green connection, that means there's 3 channels, a red, a green, and a blue channel leading from the file output color to the shader input color. And again, it's a vector, meaning a 3-way connection, red, green, and blue, because color is coming through. With the yellow thick line, you have a lot of connections coming through. Don't really need to know exactly what these connections are. All you really need to concern yourself with is that this tells this file node how to orient itself onto the shader. If, for the sake of argument, I have to do a lot of editing of the placement, let's take a look at the placement node. Let's see, we can change its rotation. We can change its repeat value. So if we wanted to repeat twice in both X and Y axes, or I should say U and V axes, we can do that. Now, I've changed the one, but I haven't changed the other. To mirror that, I can simply copy these values, 46.154, and put it into the rotate. Or, better yet, if I use the middle mouse button to drag the placement node onto the other file and let go, I'll get a pop-up menu. If I simply select default, it'll instantly copy that input to the file. And I simply don't need this anymore, so I'll hit delete on the keyboard to get rid of it. Now, the one placement node is feeding into both of these files. So I changed the one, and both of the placements are working. This is especially useful when you have multiple uses for a texture file that feed into the shader in different ways. In this case, incandescence and color. A very useful feature to save yourself some time by putting both the files into the one placement. Now let's take a look at adding a transparency. Let's say I want to reuse one of my file nodes that's already in the Hypershade. I simply middle mouse button drag over to the shader, and I'll have a few different options, and I can put that right onto transparency. I don't quite want to keep that, so I'll go into the shader and I'll simply right click on the transparency map and break connection, which will essentially delete that connection going in. With this workflow, you can create very complex shaders and very complex networks that feed a lot of different utilities into material that looks exactly the way that you want it. Let's go back to our dual view and let's take a look at one of our wood textures. Here's the wood front. Let's go ahead and graph the input and output connections. And we'll see this time we're using a 3D texture. This is a procedural texture from Maya called wood. And this texture has a 3D placement on it, which is a little bit similar to the 2D placement node we just took a look at with our flat picture. Except this placement has a physical node that you can see. If you move that, it will change the placement of the wood texture accordingly. So you can see how it's going. You can see that the wood front shader, if I right click and select objects with material, you can see that shader is applied to the front and back wood parts of this wagon. This is its 3D placement node, so I can interactively move it around, and that will change how it looks in the render. If I save this in the buffer in my render view, I'll go ahead and appreciably move this placement node, and we'll take another quick render and see how that changes. Because I saved it in the buffer, I can simply scrub back and forth, and that placement has changed the material look of it. That's one of the reasons why this is called a procedural texture within Maya, because you can change it from within Maya. I didn't have to go to Photoshop and change the actual wood grain in an image file because Maya is generating that itself. Now let's take a look at a more complex shader, and that is the one I've created for the wheel. If I input and output its connections, I can see quite a few different nodes that create what this wheel looks like. So you can see one shader feeds one object, but two different materials. A black material for the tire and a white material for the hubcap. And that's created with a bump and several nodes and a ramp that places everything together. Let's take a very quick look at how the shader is set up. This is a layered shader, which has two different materials feeding into it. We have a white shader, which is smooth and has a tight specular highlight to give it kind of a shiny plastic look. And then we have a tire shader, which is a broader, more rubber look to it. Using this ramp, we're able to place where the black is and where the white is. If I go into the ramp attributes, I can change the ramp, and as I move it, you can see on the back wheel that it's moving where the black is and where the white is. You can see I'm encroaching into the hubcap by moving the ramp down. This placement tells the layered shader where the white material goes and where the black material goes, by essentially feeding into the transparency. You can see that right there. Getting used to Maya's shading workflow will give you extremely powerful materials and extremely powerful rendering capabilities. It may look daunting at first and a little bit confusing, but if you stick with it, you'll be making extremely complicated shading setups in no time, and this entire workflow will become very second nature to you. Being exposed to it early on may seem a little confusing. That's why you'll start with your own simple shading networks and graduate into more complex ones. In this video, we took a look at the interoperability of render nodes and shader nodes and how the hypershade is read to see what nodes go where and what they do within your scene.